Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. It's good to be back. I'm going to be reading you today Saint Gregory from the Golden Legend by Jacobus de Vergine. The name Gregory, Gregorius, is formed from Grex, flock, and gore, which means to preach or to say, and Saint Gregory was preacher to his flock. Or the name resembles egregious from egregious, outstanding, and gore, and Gregory was an outstanding preacher and doctor. Or gregarious, in our language, suggests vigilance, watchfulness, and the saint watched over himself, over God, and over his flock. Over himself by virtuous living, over God by inward contemplation, over the flock by assiduous preaching, and in these three ways he merited the vision of God. So Augustine says in his book, "He who lives well, studies well, and prays well, sees God." Gregory's life was written by Paul, historian of the Lombards, and at a later time was more carefully compiled by John the deacon. Gregory was born into a senatorial family. His father's name was Gordianus, and his mother's Sylvia. While still an adolescent, he reached a high level of learning. He was also exceedingly wealthy, yet he considered leaving all before him and committing himself to a religious way of life. For a long time, however, he put off this conversion. He thought that he might more safely put himself in the service of God by appearing to remain in the world as an urbane magistrate, but the demands of secular affairs soon weighed on him so heavily that he was snared in them, not only in appearance but in mind. After his father died, Gregory built 6 monasteries in Sicily and established a 7th in his own house within the city walls, dedicating this one in honor of St. Andrew the Apostle. He lived there, laying aside his silken robes, with their adornment of gold and gems, for the rough tunic of a monk. In a short time he attained such holiness that in the very beginning of his new life he could already be counted among the perfect. Indeed, the measure of his perfection may be gauged from the words he later wrote in the prologue to his dialogues. "My unhappy spirit, stricken with the wounds of its present cares, recalls how different life was in the monastery, how the spirit let everything go by beneath it, and rose above the transitory to think upon nothing but the things of heaven. Even while still retained in the body, it escaped the confinement of the flesh by contemplation and loved death itself, the thought of which is so painful to most people, because death is the entrance to life and the reward of labor. Furthermore, he chastised his body so severely that his stomach was weakened, and he barely stayed alive. He frequently suffered the kind of fainting spells called syncope by the Greeks, at which time he seemed close to death. One day, when he was busy writing in one of his monasteries, over which he presided as abbot, an angel of the Lord came to him in a guise of a shipwrecked seaman and pleaded for help. Shedding floods of tears, Gregory had some silver coins given to him, but he came back the same day, complaining that he had lost much and had been given little. And again he received money. Yet a third time he came, making a nuisance of himself with his loud demands for help. The monk in charge of the monastery's property informed Gregory that there was nothing left to give the beggar but a silver dish in which Gregory's mother in times past had sent vegetables for his meal. The saint immediately said to give the dish to the mendicant, who accepted it joyfully and went his way, but the beggar was really an angel of God, as he afterwards made himself known. Another day, when Gregory was walking through the marketplace in Rome, he noticed a group of young men, handsome in form and features, whose blond hair attracted admiring attention. They were slaves and were being sold. Gregory asked the trader where they came from, and he answered, "From Britain, where all the inhabitants have the same fair skin and blond hair as these do." Gregory asked if they were Christians, and the merchant replied, "No, they are benighted pagans." Gregory groaned sadly and said, "What a pity that the Prince of Darkness should possess these radiant faces." He then asked the name of the people and was told that they were called Angels. "And well named," he said. "The name sounds like angels, and their faces are angelic." He asked what their province was called, and was told that their provincial name was Deiri. "Again well named," said Gregory, "because they are to be rescued, Deira, from the wrath." He inquired about the name of their king, and the trader said that he was called Ale. "Ale is right," said Gregory, "because Alleluia must be sung in their land." Shortly thereafter, Gregory called upon the Pope, and the pontiff yielded to his insistent pleading, agreed to send him to convert the English. He was well on his way when the Romans, distressed at his absence, went to the Pope and addressed him as follows: "You have offended St. Peter and destroyed Rome by sending Gregory away." This alarmed the Pope, who hastened to send messengers after the saintly abbot, calling him back. Gregory had been on the road for 3 days and had stopped to give his traveling companions a chance to rest. He himself was reading when a locust lighted on his book, forcing him to desist from his reading and making him realize, by the very meaning of the insect's name, that he should stay in the same locus. It was the spirit of prophecy that enabled him to understand this. He therefore exhorted his companions to resume their journey as fast as possible, while he waited for the papal messengers and was compelled to turn back to Rome, sad though he was to do so. Then the Pope took him out of his monastery and ordained him to be his cardinal deacon. The Tiber once overflowed its banks so far that it came over the city walls and demolished a large number of houses. The river carried a great many serpents and huge dragons down to the sea, but the waves smothered the beasts and tossed them onto the shore. The stench of their rotting bodies bred a deadly pestilence called the bubonic plague, and people seemed to see arrows coming from heaven and striking this one and that one. The first to be stricken was Pope Pelagius, who died within hours, and the plague swept through the population so fatally that many houses stood empty in the city. The Church of God, however, could not be without a head, and the people unanimously elected Gregory to be their bishop, although he made every effort to dissuade them. He had to be consecrated Bishop of Rome, but the plague was causing havoc in the city, so he preached to the people, organized a procession, and had litanies recited, exhorting everyone to pray zealously to the Lord, even while the entire population pleaded with God. However, in any 1 hour 90 men died. But Gregory continued to urge all to pray until the divine mercy should banish the plague. When the procession was finished, Gregory tried to flee from Rome, but could not, because they watched for him day and night at the city gates. At length, he changed his clothes and persuaded some tradesmen to hide him in a wine cask and get him out of the city in a wagon. When they reached a forest, he made for a hiding place in the caves and hid there for 3 days. A relentless search for him was under way, and a bright column of light beamed down from heaven and appeared over the place where he had concealed himself. A certain hermit saw angels descending and ascending in this beam. Of course, this led the pursuers to Gregory, and they carried him back to Rome and consecrated him as supreme pontiff. That he accepted this highest honor against his will is clear to anyone who reads his writings. In a letter to the patrician Narsus, he wrote, "When you describe the heights of contemplation, you renew my grief at my own ruin, because I hear what I had lost inwardly when I unworthily mounted outwardly to this summit of power. I want you to know that I am oppressed with such grief that I can hardly speak. Therefore, do not call me Naomi, beautiful, but call me Mara, because I am filled with bitterness." And elsewhere he wrote, If knowing that I have been raised to the order of bishop, you love me, weep, because I myself ceaselessly shed tears, and I beg you to pray God for me. In the prologue to his dialogues, he says, due to my pastoral responsibilities, my spirit suffers from engagement in the affairs of men and of the world, and after having enjoyed the beauty of spiritual quiet, it is spoiled with the dust of earthly business. I ponder therefore what I have put up with. I ponder what I have lost. As I fix my attention on what I have lost, my present burden grows heavier. So I am tossed about as if by the waves of the sea. The mighty storm winds beat upon the ship of my mind. And when I recall my former life, my eyes look back. I see the shore and I sigh. The plague was still ravaging Rome, and Gregory ordered the procession to continue to make the circuit of the city, and the marchers chanting the litanies. An image of the Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, was carried in the procession. It is said that this image is still in the church of Saint Mary Major in Rome, that it was painted by Saint Luke, who was not only a physician but a distinguished painter, and that it was a perfect likeness of the Virgin. And lo, behold, the poisonous uncleanliness of the air yielded to the image, as if fleeing from it, and being unable to withstand its presence. The passage of the picture brought about a wonderful serenity and purity in the air. We are also told that the voices of angels were heard around the image singing Regina Caeli Laetare, to which Gregory promptly added Ora pro nobis. Then the Pope saw an angel of the Lord standing atop the castle of Crescentius, wiping a bloody sword and sheathing it. Gregory understood that put an end to the plague, as indeed happened. Thereafter the castle was called the Castle of the Holy Angel. In time, moreover, the Pope sent Augustine, Mellitus, John, and some other missionaries to England, as he had long wished to do. By his prayers and merits, he brought about the conversion of the English to the faith. He was so generous in almsgiving that he saw to the needs not only of the people close by, but of others far away. Thus, he provided for the monks on Mount Sinai. He kept a register of those in need and took care of them liberally. He established a monastery in Jerusalem and made provisions for the servants of God who lived there. And he reserved 80 pounds of gold annually for the daily expenses of 3,000 handmaids of God. He invited pilgrims to his table every day. One day he was about to humble himself by pouring water on the hands of one such pilgrim, and turned around to pick up a jug of water. But when he turned back, the one whose hands he meant to wash had disappeared. He wondered at this, and that very night the Lord appeared to him and said, on other days you have waited on me in my members, but yesterday it was I myself whom you welcomed. Another time he ordered his steward to invite 12 pilgrims to dine with him, and the steward carried out his orders. When all were seated, however, the Pope looked around and counted 13. He summoned the steward and asked why he had presumed, against his orders, to invite 13 guests. The steward counted, and finding only 12, said, "Believe me, Father, there are only 12 here." Then Gregory noticed that the countenance of one pilgrim, who was seated close to him, changed again and again. Now it was the face of a young man, and then was like that of a venerable ancient. When the meal was finished, the Pope brought this man into a side room and insisted that he be good enough to make himself and his name known. The pilgrim answered, "Why do you ask me my name, which is marvelous? Nevertheless, know that I am that shipwrecked seaman to whom you gave the silver dish in which your mother had sent you vegetables. Know for certain also that from the very day on which you gave me the dish, the Lord destined you to become the head of his church and the successor of Peter the Apostle." Gregory asked him, "How did you know that the Lord had destined me to rule over his church?" And the answer was, "I knew it because I am his angel, and the Lord sent me back so that I might always protect you, and through me you might obtain from him whatever you ask." And in twinkling of an eye, he disappeared. At the time there was a certain hermit, a man of great virtue, who had given up all for God and possessed nothing but a cat, which he petted and fondled in his lap almost as if it were a woman who lived with him. The hermits prayed to God to deign to show him with whom he, who for the love of him possessed no earthly wealth, might hope to dwell in the future by way of remuneration. One night it was revealed to him that he might hope to share a dwelling with Gregory, the Roman pontiff, but the hermit groaned with disappointment, thinking that his voluntary poverty was of little benefit to him if he was to receive his reward with one who enjoyed such an abundance of worldly goods. As he went on day after day, grieving at the thought of his poverty and Gregory's wealth, there came another night when he heard the Lord saying to him, "It is not the possession of wealth, but the love of it that makes a man rich. How dare you compare your poverty with Gregory's riches, you who prove every day that you love that cat, your treasure, by the way you stroke it, while he does not love the wealth that surrounds him, but despises it and gives it away open-handedly to all who need it." The solitary therefore gave thanks to God and began to pray that he who had thought his merit was belittled by being compared with the popes might in time be found worthy of dwelling with Gregory. Upon being falsely accused before Emperor Maurice and his sons of having had something to do with the death of a certain bishop, Gregory wrote a letter to the emperor's deputy in which he said, "One thing you might mention to my lords is that if I, their servant, had wished to have a hand in causing death of harm to the Lombards, today the Lombard nation would have no king, no dukes, no counts, and would be in chaos. But because I fear God, I would be afraid to become involved in the death of many men." You see how humble he was, calling himself the emperor's servant, and the emperor his lord and master, although he was the supreme pontiff. See his humility when he refused to agree to the death of his enemies, and when Emperor Maurice persecuted Gregory and the Church of God. Gregory wrote this, among other things, to him: "Because I am a sinner, I believe that the more you inflict distress upon me, who serve him so badly, the more you placate Almighty God." One day, a figure dressed in a monkish habit stood fearlessly before the emperor, brandishing a drawn sword at him, and predicted that Maurice would die by the sword. The emperor, terrified, put an end to his persecution of the pope and earnestly begged him to pray that God would deign to punish him in this life for his wrongdoing, rather than reserving his punishment to the final judgment. Then Maurice had a vision. He saw himself standing outside the judge's tribunal, the judge calling out, "Bring Maurice here." Whereupon the attendant seized him and set him down before the judge. The judge asked him, "Where do you want me to pay you back for the wrongs you perpetuated in this world?" The emperor answered, "Pay me my just deserts here, Lord, rather than in the life to come." At once the voice of God gave orders that Maurice, his wife, and his sons and daughters be turned over to the soldier Phocas and be killed by him. And that is what happened. Not long afterwards, Phocas, one of his soldiers, put him and his whole family to death by the sword and succeeded him in the empire. One Easter Sunday, when Gregory was celebrating the Mass in the Church of Saint Mary Major and pronounced the Pax Domini, an angel responded in a loud voice, "Et cum spiritu tuo." From then on, the popes made that basilica a station, and in testimony of this miracle, no response is made when the Pax Domini is sung there. Once, when the Roman Emperor Trajan was hurrying off to war with all possible speed, a widow ran up to him in tears and said, "Be good enough, I beg you, to avenge the blood of my son, who was put to death. though he was innocent. Trajan answered that if he came back from the war safe and sound, he would take care of her case. And if you die in battle, the widow objected, who then will see that justice is done? Whoever rules after me, Trajan replied. And what good will it do you, the widow argued, if someone else writes my loss? None at all, the emperor retorted. Then wouldn't it be better for you, the woman persisted, to do me justice yourself and receive the reward than to pass it on to someone else? Trajan, moved with compassion, got down from his horse and saw to it that the blood of the innocent man was avenged. We also read that one of Trajan's sons was galloping his horse recklessly through the city and ran down the son of a widow, killing him. When the grief-stricken mother related this incident to Trajan, he handed over his own son, the one who had done the deed, to the widow to replace the son she had lost, and endowed her liberally besides. One day, many years after that emperor's death, as Gregory was crossing through Trajan's forum, the emperor's kindness came to his mind, and he went to St. Peter's Basilica and lamented the ruler's errors with bitter tears. The voice of God responded from above, I have granted your petition and spared Trajan's eternal punishment, but from now on be extremely careful not to pray for a damned soul. Furthermore, John of Damascus, in one of his sermons, related that as Gregory was pouring forth prayers for Trajan, he heard a divine voice coming to him, which said, I have heard your voice, and I grant pardon to Trajan. Of this, as John says in the same sermon, both East and West are witness. On this subject, some have said that Trajan was restored to life, and in this life obtained grace and merited pardon. Thus he attained glory and was not finally committed to hell, nor definitively sentenced to eternal punishment. There are others who have said that Trajan's soul was not simply freed from being sentenced to eternal punishment, but that his sentence was suspended for a time, namely, until the day of last judgment. Others have held that Trajan's punishment was assessed to him sub conditione as to place and mode of torment, the condition being that sooner or later Gregory would pray that through the grace of Christ there would be some change of place or mode. Still others, among them John the deacon who compiled this legend, says that Gregory did not pray but wept, and often the Lord in his mercy grants what a man, however desirous he might be, would not presume to ask for, and that Trajan's soul was not delivered from hell and given a place in heaven, but was simply freed from tortures of hell. A soul, he says, can be in hell and yet, through God's mercy, not feel its pains. Then there are those who explain the eternal punishment is twofold, consisting first in the pain of sins and second in the pain of loss, being deprived of the vision of God. Thus Trajan's punishment would have been remitted as to the first pain, but retained as to the second. We are told, moreover, that the angel also said, because you pleaded for a damned person, you are given a dual option. Either you will endure 2 days of torment in purgatory, or you will certainly be harassed your whole life long by infirmities and pains and aches. Gregory chose to be stricken throughout his life by pains rather than to endure 2 days in purgatory. And so he was constantly struggling with fevers, coping with gout, or shaking with severe pains, or racked with excruciating stomach cramps. Indeed, he wrote as follows in one of his letters, I am beset with so much gout and so many kinds of pain that my life is to me a most grievous punishment. Daily I grow weak with sufferings and sigh exceptionally for the remedy of death. In the same vein, in another letter, the pain I bear is mild at times and very severe at others, but never so mild as to go away, and never so severe as to kill me. So it happens that, though I am dying daily, I am held at bay by death. I am so thoroughly penetrated by noxious humors that living is an ordeal, and I look forward eagerly to death, which I think is the only remedy for my sufferings. A certain woman used to bring altar breads to Gregory every Sunday morning, and one Sunday, when the time came for receiving communion, and he held out the body of the Lord to her, saying, "May the body of our Lord Jesus Christ benefit you unto life everlasting," she laughed as if at a joke. He immediately drew back his hand from her mouth and laid the consecrated host on the altar, and then, before the whole assembly, asked her why she had dared to laugh. Her answer, "Because you called this bread, which I made with my own hands, the body of the Lord." And then Gregory, faced with the woman's lack of belief, prostrated himself in prayer. And when he rose, he found the particle of bread changed into flesh in the shape of a finger. Seeing this, the woman recovered her faith, and then he prayed again, saw the flesh return to the form of bread, and gave communion to the woman. Certain princes asked Gregory for some precious relics, and he gave them a swatch from the dalmatic of St. John the Evangelist. But they regarded this as worthless and unworthy of their rank, and indignantly returned it to him. Then St. Gregory, having prayed over it, asked for a knife and slashed the patch of cloth. Blood gushed at once from the cut, thus miraculously demonstrating the preciousness of the relics. One of Rome's rich men left his wife, and for that was denied communion by the Pope. The man took this as a personal affront, but, since he could not openly resist the authority of the Supreme Pontiff, sought help from sorcerers. They promised to use their incantations to send a demon into the Pope's horse, to madden it and endanger both horse and rider. So when Gregory happened to be riding by on his palfrey, the magicians sent in their demon and upset the horse so much that no one could hold it. Gregory, however, knew by the spirit that a demon was at work, and by making the sign of the cross over the animal, delivered it from the spell, which fell upon the sorcerers in the form of perpetual blindness. They then admitted their guilt, and later attained the grace of baptism. The Pope, however, would not have their eyesight restored, for fear they might take up their magical arts again. But he gave orders that their living was to be provided from the church funds. We also read in a book which the Greeks call Laimon, that the abbot who presided over St. Gregory's monastery informed the Pope that one of his monks had laid away 3 pieces of money for himself. Gregory, to put the fear of punishment in the other monks, excommunicated the guilty brother. Some time later the offender died, and Gregory, being unaware of his death, and he aggrieved that the monk had died without absolution, wrote a prayer as an epitaph, absolving the defunct from the bond of excommunication. He gave this script to a deacon with orders to read it over the dead monk's grave. The order was carried out, and the following night the deceased appeared to the abbot and told him that he had been held in custody, but had been set free the previous day. Gregory remodeled the church's office and chant, and founded a school for the chanters, for which he built 2 houses, one next to St. Peter's Basilica and the other near the Lateran Church. There the couch on which he reclined while he attended to the singing, and the rod with which he used to threaten the choir boys, together with an antiphonary from his own hand, are preserved with due veneration. To the canon of the Mass he added the words, "And we pray thee, order our days in thy peace, and command that we be saved from eternal damnation and numbered in the flock of thy chosen." At length, Blessed Gregory, having reigned for 13 years, 6 months, and 10 days, departed this life full of good works. On his tomb these verses are inscribed: "Receive, O earth, what was taken from thy body, which thou canst give back when God vivifies it. The spirit soars to the stars, no ills can harm the happy one, for whom death itself is the way to that other life." In this tomb are enclosed the remains of that supreme pontiff, who ever and everywhere lived in good works. His death occurred in the year 604, from the incarnation of the Lord under the Emperor Phocas. After Blessed Gregory's death, a great famine scourged the whole region, and the poor people, for whom Gregory also provided food, went to his successor and said, "Holy Father, may your holiness not allow us to die of hunger, since our Father Gregory used to feed us." These words angered the new pope, who answered, "Gregory, to win fame and praise, may have taken it upon himself to provide for all peoples, but we ourselves can do nothing for you." And he always sent them away empty-handed. Saint Gregory appeared to him 3 times and chided him gently for being so frugal and for speaking unkindly of him. But the Pope made no move to change his conduct. Saint Gregory, now stern and fearsome, appeared a 4th time and struck him a lethal blow on the head, which caused him great pain, brought him to an early death. The famine persisted, and some of Gregory's envious associates began to defame him, declaring that he was a spendthrift who had squandered the church's wealth. They wanted to avenge his alleged prodigality by inducing others to burn the saint's books. Some were indeed burned, and his critics were of a mind to burn all of them. But Peter, Gregory's deacon, who had been very close to him and is his interlocutor in the 4 books of his dialogues, put up a vigorous resistance. He pointed out that their action would in no way detract from the late Pope's memory, and since copies of his books were already in circulation in various regions of the world, and added that it would be a monstrous sacrilege to destroy so many great works of so great a father, over whose head he himself had often seen the Holy Spirit in the likeness of a dove. In the end, he got them to agree that if he, Peter, merited immediate death by confirming by oath the truth of what he had told them, they would desist from burning the books, but if he was not to die but survive after giving his sworn testimony, he himself would lend a hand to the book burning. In fact, we read that Gregory had told Peter that if he publicized the miracles of the vision of the dove, he would die on the spot. Therefore, the venerable Peter, dressed in deacon's robes and carrying the book of the Gospels, gave witness to Gregory's holiness, and in the very act of pronouncing the words of this true confession, gave up the ghost without suffering the last agony. There was a monk in Saint Gregory's monastery who had put aside a sum of money. Blessed Gregory appeared to another monk and told him to direct the first one to get rid of his money and to do penance, because he was to die in 3 days. Hearing this, the guilty monk was shaken with fear, did penance, and gave up his money. But he was soon stricken with such a fever that from dawn to the 3rd hour of the 3rd day the burning was so intense that his tongue stuck out of his mouth, and he seemed to be breathing his last. His brother monks stood round him chanting the psalms, but after some time they interrupted their psalmody and began to talk about his faults. He then revived enough to smile and blink his eyes at them, saying, "May the Lord forgive you, brother, for wanting to bring up my failings. You put me in a difficult dilemma, because I was being accused both by you and by the devil at the same time, and did not know which accusation to answer first. But if ever you see someone at the point of death, don't denigrate him, but treat him with compassion as one who, with his accuser at his side, is going to be judged by a very strict judge. I stood for judgment with the devil accusing me, but with Saint Gregory's help, I gave good answer to all his charges, except one only, about which I was ashamed. For that one, as you have seen, I have been sorely punished and have not yet been able to get free of it." The brothers pressed him to tell them what he had been accused of, but he replied, "I dare not say, because when Blessed Gregory commanded me to come back to you, the devil protested vehemently, thinking that God himself was sending me back to do penance for that one thing. Therefore I gave Blessed Gregory my warrant that I would not reveal to anyone the calumny in question. Then he shouted, "Oh, Andrew, Andrew, may you perish this year, because by your wicked counsel you brought me to this peril." And then and there, rolling his eyes frightfully, he expired. Now there was in the city a man named Andrew. At the very moment when the dying monk cursed him, Andrew was seized by a malady so lethal that he was wasting away, the flesh falling from his bones, yet could not die. He called the monks of Saint Gregory's monastery together and confessed to them that with the help of the aforementioned monk he had stolen certain papers belonging to the monastery and had sold them to outsiders for money. This man, who had been unable to die, breathed his last as he was making his confession. In this period, as we read in the life of Saint Eugene, the Ambrosian office, rather than the Gregorian, was still observed by the churches, and the Roman pontiff, whose name was Hadrian, convened a council at which it was decreed that Gregorian office was to be followed universally. Emperor Charlemagne, acting as executor of this decree, traveled round the various provinces and, by threat and penalties, compelled all clerics to obey it. He also burned the books of the Ambrosian office wherever found, and imprisoned many rebellious clergy. The blessed Bishop Eugene set out for the council, but found that it had disbanded 3 days before his arrival. It was his prudent decision to persuade the Pope to recall all the prelates who had taken part in the council, though they were already 3 days on the road. At the newly convoked council, it was the unanimous decision of the fathers that the Ambrosian and Gregorian missals should be placed on the altar of St. Peter. The doors of the church should be closed tight and carefully sealed with the seals of a large number of bishops, and the bishops themselves should spend the night praying the Lord to indicate by some sign which of the two offices he wanted observed by the churches. Everything was done as ordered. When they opened the church doors in the morning, they found both missals lying open on the altar, or, as others state, they discovered the Gregorian missal broken up, scattered here and there, whereas the Ambrosian volume was simply open and lay where it had been placed on the altar. The bishops saw this as a sign from God, indicating that the Gregorian office should be spread through the world, while the Ambrosian was to be observed only in the church of St. Ambrose. The Holy Fathers so decreed, and their decree is followed to this day. I hope you have enjoyed this reading of Saint Gregory. It's really amazing that through him, England was converted. Join me on Wednesday for a reading, and then again Sunday for a religious reading. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.